Good afternoon. Welcome to the 25th conference organized by the Moses Mendelssohn Chair of Jewish Studies. On this occasion, a very special occasion, Dr. Jeffrey Barash will give his lecture, Cassirer in front of Heidegger, before, during, and after Davos. It is an honor for us that we share with you this event. Jeffrey Andrew Barash is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Picardie University, Amiens. He obtained his PhD from the University of Chicago. He has taught at the University of Hamburg and Boston College and was a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies, Princeton. His area of studies covers the topics of collective memory, political philosophy, phenomenology, and political myth. He is the author of the books Martin Heidegger and the Problem of Historical Meaning, Fordham University Press, 2003, Politique de l'Histoire, l'Historicisme, comme promesse et comme mythe, Presse Universitaire de France, 2004, and Collective Memory and the Historical Past, University of Chicago Press, 2016.
Okay. So I would like to thank Professor Pablo Draxic for this invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to speak before you today. And as he announced, my talk is titled Theology and Politics, Ernst Cassirer and Martin Heidegger before, in, and after the Davos debate. In December 1923, nearly 6 years before the debate that brought them face to face in Davos, Switzerland in 1929, Ernst Cassirer invited the young Martin Heidegger, who at the time was extraordinarius professor at the University of Marburg, to give a talk before the Kant Society, the Kant Gesellschaft, in Hamburg, where Cassirer taught. During his stay in Hamburg, which lasted several days, Heidegger spoke on the theme, the task and the ways of phenomenological research, Aufgabe und Wege der phenomenologischen Forschung. In a still unpublished letter that Heidegger wrote to his wife Elfriede, dated December 19th, 1923, which was not included in the published collection of their correspondence, he wrote that he was a guest in the home of the psychologist Wilhelm Stern, professor at the University of Hamburg and the father of Günther Stern, Günther Anders, the future husband of Hannah Arendt. My talk went well, Heidegger wrote, before a large audience. The city is wonderful. Cassirer and other professors who attended my lecture would like to invite me for a talk next year at the Warburg Library. The Sterns are extremely nice and would like me to prolong my stay until Friday morning. They haven't left me for a moment. Several years later, Heidegger referred to this first encounter with Cassirer in Hamburg in a footnote found in section 12 of Sein und Zeit, entitled Existential Analytics and the Interpretation of Primitive Dasein. In this reference, Heidegger notes a certain agreement, an Übereinstimmung, he reached with Cassirer during the discussion following the talk concerning the need to elaborate an existential analytic, as you can read in the footnote of Sein und Zeit. In spite of the statement of their accord in Hamburg, it would be difficult to imagine two more divergent personalities and philosophical orientations. Later in Davos, it is above all this discord that came to light. The different points of their disagreement have recently become a topic of detailed analysis, and here my purpose can't be to re-examine all of the different interpretations of Davos that have been proposed over the last decades, and I have also analyzed somewhat in other writings. What I want to do today in this talk is rather to return to the Davos debate in order to place it in a somewhat unusual perspective. The angle of approach I will adopt was suggested to me by a critical appraisal of Heidegger's philosophy that Cassirer presented in Davos on the evening before the first debate in a preliminary talk, the so-called Heidegger lecture, the Heidegger Vorlesung. It's a lecture that remained unpublished until 2014, when it was printed among previously unpublished writings included in the recent Hamburg edition of Heidegger's collected works. It's the Nachlassausgabe. In this lecture, Cassirer identified what he took to be the deep sources of Heidegger's philosophy of existence, arising from presuppositions of an essentially theological order. Oddly enough, however, Cassirer never returned to this theme, neither in his debate with Heidegger at Davos, nor in later writings. What I will do today is to scrutinize Cassirer's reference to the theological presuppositions that animated Heidegger's orientation. According to the argument I'll present today, an examination of Cassirer's and Heidegger's divergent attitudes toward theology permits us to set their respective philosophical positions in a novel light. And as I will attempt to illustrate in the concluding sections of this talk, analysis of their respective attitudes toward theology at the same time reveals an important source of the political philosophy that Cassirer elaborated in the decades following the debate at Davos. We do not know today if the theme of theology arose in the discussions that took place between Cassirer and Heidegger in 1923 during Heidegger's brief sojourn in Hamburg. Perhaps Cassirer was able to discern the importance of this topic for Heidegger's philosophical orientation in this period preceding the publication of Sein und Zeit. Heidegger had taken a certain distance from the Catholic tradition in which he had been brought up and with which he had been closely affiliated during the period of his studies at the University of Freiburg in Breisgau. Following his marriage in 1917 with a Protestant woman, Elfriede Petri, in his intensive study of the writings of Martin Luther, themes related to Protestant theology began to have a profound impact on his thought, as witnessed by the courses he taught as a young Privatdozent at Freiburg during the years following World War I that are collected in volume 60 of his Gesamtausgabe under the title of Philosophy of Religious Life. In regard to Luther and Christian religiosity, Heidegger wrote the following lines to his wife Elfriede in a letter he sent to her in September 1919. Since my reading of Luther's, I quote him, since my reading of Luther's commentary on the Epistle to the Romans, many things that were previously troubling and opaque have become clear and are a source of liberation for me. I understand the Middle Ages and the development of Christian religiosity in a fully different light. And this has opened completely new perspectives in regard to the philosophy of religion. Heidegger maintained his strong interest in theology, above all in the writings of Luther, during the period of his teaching at the University of Marburg after 1923. During his 4 years at Marburg, Heidegger collaborated with the Protestant theologian Rudolf Bultmann. In 1927, the year in which Sein und Zeit appeared, he wrote to Bultmann, I quote Heidegger from their correspondence, Augustine, Luther, Kierkegaard are philosophically essential for the formation of a radical comprehension of Dasein. And in the introduction to Sein und Zeit, in the very first pages of Sein und Zeit, Heidegger asserted that theologians, in light of a renewal of interest in Luther's writings, had begun to formulate more original positions. Moreover, the reflections proposed throughout this work on Paul, Augustine, Luther, and Kierkegaard illustrate their profound significance for his philosophical analyses. If we bear in mind this role of theology for the elaboration of Heidegger's ontological standpoint, it is curious that this theme was never directly mentioned in his commentary on Cassirer's philosophy. In his book, Mythical Thought, the second volume of the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, which appeared in 1925, Cassirer dealt in detail with Christian theological themes in the more general context of analysis of the distinction between myth and religion. Following the publication of this work, Heidegger wrote a review in which he examined Cassirer's theory of myth, without, however, paying any attention to Cassirer's conception of the phenomenon of religion, and more specifically of the Christian religion. Not only in this review, but also in subsequent remarks on Cassirer's philosophy, whether in his contemporary Freiburg courses, in Sein und Zeit, or later at Davos, Heidegger never mentioned this theme of the Christian religion as Cassirer analyzed. It is as if the topic of religion, considered from their respective viewpoints, were too present, too close, perhaps even too troubling to be evoked in any direct confrontation. Be this as it may, the criticism Heidegger elaborated of the epistemological foundations of Cassirer's theory of myth clearly challenged his manner of historical reflection on myth, and did so in a way that touches, at least indirectly, on his concept of religion. It is therefore to Heidegger's oblique critique of Cassirer's conception of religion that I will now turn in order to set in relief the counter-critique Cassirer developed at Davos during the years that followed. The manner of historical reflection that Cassirer adopted in his interpretation of myth and of its relation to religion owed a good deal to the inspiration of his mentor, Hermann Cohen. For Cohen, as for Cassirer, Jewish monotheism, above all, is represented by the prophets, as well as Christian monotheism, each contributed to a general movement elaborated over the course of history. Judaism and Christianity, through faith in a unique transcendent God, surmounted the rudimentary forms of mythical thought that had identified its deities with occult forces deployed by things in the immanent world. The great contribution of the Jewish prophets, which was reaffirmed in another sense by early Christianity and reinforced by the Protestant Reformation, lay in a firm rejection of an alleged magical potency deployed by idols and other worldly objects. Over the course of their historical development, the great monotheistic religions, Judaism and Christianity especially, are underlined here, reinterpreted the sense of religious faith in directing it toward divine transcendence beyond the tangible things of this world. In situating the specific contribution of Christianity, which the Protestant Reformation raised to its fullest expression, Hermann Cohen recognized in Luther's work a continuation of the movement inaugurated by the Hebrew prophets. In Cohen's words in his book, Ethik des reinen Willens, published in 1904, as the prophets struggled against sacrifice, so Luther opposed faith to works, above all works in the sense of the church. The works of the church are like ancient sacrifice transformed into mystery. In the eyes of Hermann Cohen, this contribution of Jewish and Christian monotheism was reinforced by the rationalism of the ancient Greek heritage. Above all, through the Platonic and Neoplatonic legacy, which from the Hellenistic period onwards had a decisive impact on the two religions. Ancient Greek rationalism and Judeo-Christian monotheism each progressively set in motion the historical movement that led to the subduing of the most rudimentary forms of myth, and subsequently to the overcoming of the remnants of mythical, magical belief still at work in Christianity. In this manner, each also brought an essential contribution to the ethical development of humanity. Indeed, over the course of human history, the progressive challenge directed against the assumption that human destiny is ruled by occult forces opened the way to the idea of individual liberty as the source of moral responsibility. While Ernst Cassirer reaffirmed the broad outlines of Cohen's interpretation of human history, his philosophy of symbolic forms modified Cohen's philosophy in an essential way. According to Cassirer's original perspective, myth and religion, science and art, like words and signs through which they are articulated, are so many symbolic forms in terms of which humans make sense of reality. It is through the historical elaboration of symbolic forms for Cassirer that human awareness of the spiritual character of religious symbols emerged, enabling humanity over the course of history to overcome the mythical, magical belief in occult powers. At the same time, the spiritualization of symbols reinforced the redirection of religious faith toward transcendence. Even more firmly than Cohen, Cassirer underlined the significance of Plato and of the Platonic heritage, which to his mind represented a decisive turning point that led to the overcoming of the mythical magical world image. Since Plato accorded a preeminent role to the autonomous power of reason in its capacity to reveal sovereign goodness that is not conditioned by the things of the sensuous world, but reigns from a realm of pure transcendence beyond their purview. In this sense, according to Plato's celebrated words in the Republic, the good is beyond being or essence, epikeina tes ousias. On this basis, Cassirer rejoined Cohen's interpretation in reaffirming the contribution of both Jewish and Christian doctrines of divine transcendence to the liberation of the human spirit, and in emphasizing the role of Martin Luther in this struggle against what he took to be the vestiges of idolatry in the rites of the Catholic Church. Cassirer wrote, and I cite him from Mythical Thinking, page 297, volume 2 of the Wissenschaftliche Buchgesellschaft edition. Cassirer wrote, "The entire history of dogma, in its evolution from the most primitive forms until Luther and Zwingli, shows us in an immediate way the perpetual combat that opposes the primordial historical sense of symbols, their meaning as sacraments and mysteries, and their derivative, purely spiritual sense. There too, the ideal wrests itself only very slowly from the sphere of material things, from effective reality." Like the Platonic heritage, the monotheistic religions reinforce this conviction concerning the spiritual significance of symbols. And in this manner, for Cassirer, as for Cohen, religion, in leading toward the gradual liberation from the hold of belief in magical forces, contributed to the development of the conviction of human ethical responsibility. While Cassirer was in agreement with Hermann Cohen's conception of the ethical role of the monotheistic religions, he nonetheless evaluated the historical significance of religion in a way that essentially differed from the ideas of his former mentor. This difference appears in its clearest form in relation to Cohen's late work, Religion of Reason from the Sources of Judaism. In this book, Cohen stressed more strongly than ever before the uniqueness of Judaism as a religious faith and the specific role of Jewish messianism for the orientation of human history, which he distinguished in this context from Christian eschatology. Whereas Christian eschatology maintains a sharp distinction between the transcendent realm and the socio-political world, Jewish messianism aims for Cohen to realize a universal ideal in the world itself and conceives this task as the ultimate goal of faith. Cassirer's symbolic interpretation of religion, however, led him in a very different direction. Indeed, as we can glean from the final part of Mythical Thought, Cassirer interpreted the history of the monotheistic religion in terms of what he saw as a tendency to overcome the tendency to come ever closer to the domain of aesthetics. Even if religion can never fully divest itself of its mythical foundations, the more it is able to free itself from the trammels of mythical belief in magical forces and to conceive of itself in spiritual and symbolic terms, the closer it approaches the domain of art. So whereas Cohen in Religion of Reason goes closer to the political dimension of messianism, Cassirer, at least in volume 2 of the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, goes closer and closer to a combination of religion with aesthetics. There's a very important difference between them. Whereas religion for Cassirer in its historical development is continually condemned to face the problem raised by the ultimate reality of its objects, this problem disappears and religious consciousness is calmed. Cassirer's word is beruhigt and placated, beschwichtigt, as soon as it beholds itself in the perspective of art. Cassirer wrote, this is the very final page of Mythical Thought. It's very important that we go through this whole book, all about the difference between myth and religion. And on the final page, nearly the last paragraph of the book, this is Cassirer's conclusion. It's extremely important. He wrote, myth always sees in the image a fragment of substantial reality, a part of the world of things endowed with forces that are equal or superior to those of the world. The religious conception strives forward from this initial magical aim to an ever purer spiritualization. And yet, even here, it finds that it is continually led to a point where the question of its meaning and truth is converted into that of the reality of its objects, a point at which, in a hard and sudden way, the problem of existence arises. Only with aesthetic consciousness is this problem truly left behind. Seems to me a very crucial point in Cassirer's analysis in the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms. So now I turn to Heidegger. During the early period of his teaching at the University of Freiburg and Breisgau, between 1919 and 1921, several years before the publication of Ernst Cassirer's Mythical Thought, Heidegger elaborated a sharp critique of the method of investigation in philosophy and in the human sciences that sought to understand the phenomenon of religion in terms of its historical manifestations. This indeed was the kind of historical investigation that inspired Cassirer's research. Like the advocates of neo-Orthodox theology, Karl Barth, Rudolf Bultmann, Friedrich Gogarten, Heidegger challenged the liberal theology that had predominated before World War I, the orientations of theologians like Adolf von Harnack or Ernst, who in a Protestant perspective had underlined the historical role of Protestantism and its importance for the emergence of modern culture. This method had clear affinities with that adopted by Hermann Cohen in the period of publication of his works, Ethics of Pure Will. Indeed, even if during these years prior to World War I, Hermann Cohen and Ernst engaged in an intense debate concerning the role of Judaism in the history of religions, conceptualization bequeathed by the ancient Greek metaphysical tradition, above all by the Platonic heritage. In its traditional role as the metaphysical model for the self-interpretation of Christian spirituality, Greek philosophy for Heidegger had deformed for unstalted Christian existence. And the only way to retrieve a pristine Christian religiosity was by liberating it from the spell of Greek conceptual presuppositions. So we see very clearly that where Cassirer and Cohen mobilize Plato in the movement of the historical development of religions and its spiritualization and turn away from mythical, magical forms of thought, Heidegger emphasizes precisely the Greek background of Christianity that had to be deconstructed and, in fact, removed from the Christian heritage, diametrically opposite position. And it's this aspect of Luther that most interested him, Luther's critique of scholasticism and Platonism. In its traditional role as the metaphysical model for the self-interpretation of Christian spirituality, Greek philosophy for Heidegger had deformed Christian existence, and the only way to retrieve a pristine Christian religiosity was by liberating it from the spell of Greek conceptual presuppositions. Here, the uniqueness of religious experience for human existence had to be made palpable, independently of the conceptual paradigms to which it had traditionally been assimilated, in accord with which modern adaptations of Platonic assumptions identified it with one among many incarnations of a superior truth, the expressions of a trans-historical continuity beyond its historical manifestations. In taking as his model what he described as the authentic practical life experience, faktische Lebenserfahrung, of the primitive Christian community, Heidegger sought to underscore the unique existential significance of a religiosity that was in no way commensurable with schema of historical development or extraneous categories of analysis. Foremost among these extraneous categories was the Platonic and Neoplatonic valorization of aesthetic qualities. Primary critique of Heidegger is precisely the aesthetic dimension of Platonism. He designated these aesthetic qualities, like religious phenomena, as touchstones of a superior transcendent truth. This is what the Platonic tradition did. A superior transcendent truth manifested in the immanent realm. And this is precisely what Heidegger sought to deconstruct. In interpreting Luther's Heidelberg Disputatio of 1518, in his early Freiburg course lectures, Heidegger emphasized that Luther's rejection of ancient Greek metaphysical concepts equated them with mere forms of idolatry and aesthetically glorify what are seen to be the wonders of the created world. From Heidegger's standpoint, authentic religious experience, far from an ongoing incarnation of a trans-historical idea of truth comparable to the durable luster of aesthetic phenomena in the immanent realm, could serve as a source of philosophical insight into the illegitimacy of such expressions of the Greek metaphysical tradition. This is precisely what had to be deconstructed. All such forms of Greek metaphysics, as he exclaimed in this and other contexts, must be resolutely deconstructed, abgebaut, submitted to phenomenological destruction. In Heidegger's eyes, the inspiration above all of Paul, Luther, and Kierkegaard serves to guide the attempt to retrieve the original sense of religious experience. They, above all, give insight into the significance of human finitude as it is faced with the necessity of choosing a mode of existence in light of future death. Here, Heidegger's understanding of Luther and Kierkegaard presents a striking anticipation of his interpretation of the finitude of human existence elaborated in Sein und Zeit. In a lecture presented in 1924, while he was in Marburg, in the seminar of Rudolf Bultmann on the problem of sin in Luther, this is in the annex of the correspondence between them, Heidegger paraphrased Kierkegaard in the following way. Heidegger wrote, "The principle of Protestantism embraces a particular presupposition, that of the anguished man who sits in the face of death in a state of fear and trembling before a harsh trial. Fort und Zittern. So now I turn to the topic of aesthetic preconceptions, and we'll move on to Davos from there. In view of Heidegger's philosophical and theological orientation, it comes as no surprise that he sharply contested Cassirer's theory of symbolic forms, and with it, his conception of myth. Where Cassirer, in mythical thought, interpreted myth, religion, and aesthetics as so many symbolic forms, Heidegger, well before Davos, identified a chasm separating primordial Christian religiosity from any other form of experience. Where Cassirer presupposed the historical articulation of symbolic forms leading to an ongoing spiritualization of the mythical components of religion. Where Cassirer suggested that the problem posed by their ultimate reality might be attenuated through appreciation of their quality as aesthetic symbols. Heidegger sharply questioned the assimilation of religious and aesthetic experience to the same conceptual schema of explanation in an ongoing process of historical development. In a course lecture presented in 1925, the year of publication of Cassirer's mythical thought, and of his review of this work, Heidegger signaled what was to his eyes the inappropriateness of Cassirer's methodology, where it indifferently subjects aesthetic, mythical, religious phenomena to the same formal models, formale Leitfaden. Heidegger wrote, "What proves to be a suitable approach in aesthetics may impede elucidation and interpretation of other phenomena." On this basis, Heidegger qualified as inadequate Cassirer's general conception of symbolic forms. In his review of mythical thought, Heidegger's critique of Cassirer centered above all on the developmental schema, in terms of which Cassirer interpreted the historical articulation of the symbolic forms. If Heidegger did not specifically allude here to Cassirer's interpretation of Christianity, he radically rejected Cassirer's idea of a fundamental historical progression of modernity beyond the mythical world image. Indeed, at the fundamental level, all human existence, whether mythical, magical, or modern, is marked by the same finitude. And finite existence necessarily comprehends itself in light of the facticity of being thrown into the world, preoccupied by unavoidable everyday concerns in the world, and faced with the inevitability of future death. No historical progress can overcome this universal existential situation. In view of the role that Cassirer attributed to mythical thought in the development of a capacity for aesthetic appreciation of mythical and religious symbols as the mark of historical progression beyond the more rudimentary forms of belief, Heidegger's sarcastic reproof of the universal schema elaborated by what he termed aesthetics at the Davos debate, in a comment made in its aftermath, takes on a curious significance. On September 4th, 1929, just after the Davos debate, a few months after, Heidegger wrote a letter to Karl Löwith, his student, and talked about the debate at Davos. Heidegger lauded the younger members of the audience who showed signs of resolution of a singular affective Dasein, and he contrasted the attitude of these younger participants in the Davos seminar with what he characterized, and I quote, as the Olympic and pretentious world-encompassing objectivity, which for aesthetes of the institution becomes an obscure and ephemeral form of enjoyment. In view of the aestheticized interpretation of the general schema of historical development of symbolic forms, that Cassirer proposed in mythical thought, was he not, in the context of Davos, the most likely target of Heidegger's critique? Following his initial reading of Heidegger's Sein und Zeit, Ernst Cassirer began to elaborate an analysis of this work, and as early as 1928, he wrote a critical commentary on it in the text Geist und Leben, which he never completed, and which in its preliminary form was posthumously published. In this text, Geist und Leben, Cassirer began to reflect on the theological sources of Heidegger's philosophy, and it is this theme that he would treat in greater depth in the famous Heidegger Vorlesung, written some months later and presented in Davos on the eve of his first encounter with Heidegger. What is immediately striking in Cassirer's Heidegger Vorlesung is not only that he examined the theme of the theological sources of Sein und Zeit, that nowhere was evoked in the debate itself. More remarkable still was the manner in which Cassirer, in function of his critique of Heidegger, modified his appraisal of Luther in comparison to his early interpretation of the reformer in mythical thought. So we see that there's already an evolution in Cassirer's attitude toward Luther through Heidegger. In his portrayal of Luther in this work, Cassirer, as I mentioned, Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, underlined what he identified as his contribution to a long historical process of desacralization of sensuous things in the world. According to Cassirer, this long process of spiritualization of the sensuous, Vergeistigung der Sinnlichen, flowed from the double source of Platonic philosophy and the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the Heidegger Vorlesung, however, Cassirer presented a wholly different side of Luther. The Luther of fear and trembling, in a guise prefiguring the analytic of Dasein. In this lecture, Luther poses the radical problem of human finitude, for he recalls the impending demise that no one can avoid. In the face of death, any quest for stability and security collapses. The search for an ideal order beyond human finitude and the contingencies of this world proves completely futile. Cassirer develops his analysis in relation to Luther's 8 sermons, professed in Wittenberg in 1523. In the 8 sermons, Luther proclaimed, I cite Luther in Cassirer's quotation in the Heidegger Vorlesung, "We all must die, and no one can die for another. Each one must seek his own rampart and engage his own struggle against the enemies that are the devil and death. At that moment, I will not be with you, nor you with me." Cassirer labeled Luther's doctrine religious individualism, a characteristic, according to him, that also emerged in the Catholic tradition in the writings of Pascal. Religious individualism challenges every objective form of religion. Heidegger interprets death in an analogous way. In his eyes, finite existence, when relying only on itself, dissolves all illusory ties, whether physical or social. According to Cassirer's paraphrase of Heidegger, death obliges each individual to turn away from the inauthentic world of anonymous everyday existence. This critique of the objective forms of religion in Luther, as in Heidegger, places in question the certitudes of the metaphysical tradition. Luther had emphasized the inscrutability of the divine will. And in light of human fallibility and mortality, he contested the role accorded by the Platonic and Stoic Christian tradition to the quest for an ideal order of the universe and to the intelligibility of eternal certitudes, in this order beyond existence and beyond radical finitude. In a novel 20th century perspective, Heidegger presented an analogous challenge to the Platonic and Stoic presupposition concerning the fundamental status of an autonomous cosmic order beyond the finitude of mortal perspectives. It is here that Cassirer broached the principal theme of his lecture. Heidegger drew from the interpretation of human finitude the conclusion that all truth is relative to the finite beings we are, the famous statement of Heidegger in Sein und Zeit. All truth is relative to the finite beings we are. And Cassirer opposed to this conclusion the Platonic Stoic idea of an unconditional, eternal, ethical truth, the intrinsic validity of which in no way depends on the finite mode of existence of the one who affirms it. This conviction, as Cassirer emphasized, was a source of inspiration for a broad intellectual tradition in the West. It also served to orient Kant's transcendental idealism independently of the critique he directed against traditional metaphysics. As we recall, on the day following Cassirer's lecture, this topic stood at the center of his debate with Heidegger. So now I turn from Davos to the last part of my lecture to talk about theology and politics. In other words, Cassirer's turn, we saw in the philosophy of symbolic forms that the political questions were very much in retreat. Then after the experience of the early 1930s, and especially 1933, we see that all of a sudden the political takes center stage and transforms his own attitude toward theology. This is the part of my concluding section. During the years after the Davos debate, Cassirer did not pursue the interpretation he proposed in the Heidegger Vorlesung of the theological sources of Heidegger's philosophy of insistence. Nonetheless, if we examine for a moment the development of his thinking in the years following Davos, one aspect of his orientation is particularly noteworthy for our present analysis. Indeed, in the framework of his conception of politics, which in the early 1930s became an ever more central topic of his reflection, Cassirer resumed his interpretation of the Lutheran heritage in a manner which bore a striking affinity with the topic of his lecture on Heidegger at Davos, the Luther of Fear and Trembling. Independently of the question of Heidegger, who in any case had at that time not yet announced his political position, we're talking about the 2 or 3 years before the Nazi seizure of power, Cassirer began to turn his attention to theological political topics, and he deepened his investigation of the theological sources of the challenge launched by Luther and Calvin against the Platonic Stoic tradition. Cassirer's most detailed analyses of the theological political topics in this period are found in 2 books published in 1932, both of them. The Platonic Renaissance in England and the Cambridge School, and in the other book, the Philosophy of Enlightenment. These were the last works Cassirer published in Germany, several months after the printing of the Philosophy of the Enlightenment. Hitler rose to power, and Cassirer left Germany for England and then Sweden before going to the United States. In view of the dire political situation in Germany in the early 1930s, Cassirer presented much more in these works, especially the Philosophy of Enlightenment, than a simple history of modern European thought. Oftentimes we talk about Cassirer as a great historian of philosophy, but this is much more than simply a history of philosophy. Rather, the theme of both of these books, but especially the Philosophy of the Enlightenment, represents a plea, a plaidoyer in favor of the aspect of the European intellectual heritage that was, in his eyes, particularly in danger, and that it was particularly important to defend. In this context, Cassirer placed in a new perspective the antinomy he had developed at Davos between Luther and the Platonic Stoic tradition. He underscored the contribution of this tradition in examining what he considered to be the precise political implications of the radical attack Luther and Calvin directed against it. The theological doctrine concerning the fallen condition of humanity and the weakness of human reason led the reformers to adopt positions of political voluntarism. In view of human finitude and the fallibility of human reason, both Luther and Calvin concluded that it was necessary to promote political doctrines in favor of strict obedience to the sovereign will. Calvin and his successors, as Cassirer noted, had called for the creation of a theocracy to provide absolute orientation for the state. The originality of Cassirer's thought during this period lies in his identification of a curious affinity between the political voluntarism of the reformers and the radical absolutism that Hobbes had advocated later on. Hobbes, in order to contest the legitimacy of theocratic principles in politics, concluded that only absolute sovereign authority could controvert the danger posed by the claims of the theologians and thus maintain the stability of the state. Thus, on the basis of starting points that were diametrically opposed to one another, the reformers and Hobbes drew the conclusion that only absolute sovereign authority, representing divine authority in the temporal realm, could prevent the outbreak of civil war and the reign of chaos. Only the sovereign, either the sovereign church or the political sovereign, was authorized to establish legitimate government and to decree what is just and unjust. It is on this basis that Luther and Calvin on one side and Hobbes on the other side contested the ideal of an autonomous political truth endowed with intrinsic validity and intelligible in the light of human reason. In spite of all other differences between them, the 16th century reformers and the theoretician of the absolute state of the 17th century shared this one central assumption. In opposition to both forms of political voluntarism, Cassirer invoked the argument of Grotius, who, in drawing on Platonic and Stoic sources, affirmed the principle of the intrinsic rational validity of truth that depends neither on the divine will nor on the human will, since neither God nor man can transform what is intrinsically good into evil, nor what is intrinsically evil into good. As Cassirer stipulated, Kant, on the basis of critical theory, set this conviction as the cornerstone of his ethico-political orientation. Kant indeed opposed any conception of politics that would make laws depend on the arbitrary sovereign will. And it was here that Kant's philosophy had inspired the earlier response to relativism that Cassirer mobilized at Davos. Even when Cassirer limited his analysis to the history of political thought without making direct reference to his contemporary period, the implications of his arguments in regard to the growing influence of new forms of political voluntarism were evident. Under the label of decisionism or political theology, this new contemporary form of voluntarism drew on the analogy between divine omnipotence and absolute sovereign power to legitimate the idea that political decisions cannot be limited by any established norm. If Cassirer approached the theme of political theology in historical perspective in this period of sharp political radicalization, which witnessed the first important victories of the Nazi Party, he nonetheless abandoned all reference to Heidegger, not only during this period, but during the years of emigration to England and Sweden from 1933 until his departure for the United States in 1941 at the beginning of of World War II. It was in the United States, at Yale University and then Columbia, in his final work, The Myth of the State, posthumously published in 1945, that he resumed his critique of Heidegger. In this context, Cassirer focused on the political implications of Heidegger's philosophical questioning of any rational or traditional order capable of claiming a fundamental status beyond the singular perspective revealed in light of human finitude and of the call to decision in the face of nothingness and of death. Nonetheless, in The Myth of the State is no longer in relation to theological voluntarism that Cassirer developed his analysis. This is a central point. He no longer refers to Heidegger and relates him to theological voluntarism at all, as he did in the Heidegger Vorlesung in Davos. He no longer even suggested that there might be a link between the philosophy of Heidegger and Luther's theology, or political theology in any precise sense of the term. His attitude toward Heidegger changed in close relation to a broader transformation of his theoretical orientation. In the final context of The Myth of the State, Cassirer accorded to Heidegger's philosophy a novelty that set it beyond the scope of all earlier forms of both myth and theology, corresponding to what Cassirer took to be the unprecedented status of the modern political myths Heidegger chose to serve. Myths of the 20th century, in this perspective, by virtue of their calculated ideological design, transform the function of spontaneous belief systems of earlier peoples while mobilizing their archaic force. This modern transformation contrasts sharply with the otherworldly orientation and ethical concern of any form of traditional theology. Hence, Heidegger's decision in 1933 to lend his support to the arbitrary power of a dictator who was subjected to no limit beyond his own will cannot be attributed to a traditional theological assumption or inspiration. It reveals the inner affinity of Heidegger's thought with novel 20th century forms of political mythology. In a passage of The Myth of the State that the American editors of this work chose not to include in the posthumously published edition, it has been republished in the new German edition, in the minor Verlag edition. They put all of the variants that were omitted by the American, initial American editors into the new edition. And in his own full analysis in The Myth of the State, the original analysis, Cassirer made a remark that illustrates his position regarding theology with particular clarity. Heidegger's critique of universal standards of truth in the sense of the Platonic tradition, as Cassirer noted, and his tendency to relativize the idea of truth and function of the singular quantity of Dasein, brought him into an ideological territory of the most arbitrary forms of 20th century political mythology. The 16th century theology of Luther, however, shared no affinity with the novel forms of myth in the 20th century, which Heidegger chose to embrace. In reference to Luther, mentioned in company with Kepler, with Winkelmann, with Herder, Cassirer laconically stated, I quote Cassirer, "It is impossible to read the National Socialist ideology into the entire text of German culture." The ultimate development in Cassirer's thought reveals a theoretical conclusion drawn on the basis of the terrible experience of World War II and the Shoah that informs The Myth of the State as a whole. In this final interpretation, traditional theological categories, however radical they may be, can in no way account for the archaic force of the myths of the 20th century and for their accompanying philosophical ideologies that had recently demonstrated the full range of their devastating potency. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to Jeffrey Barash for this incredible, very interesting, thought-provoking conference. Now we will open the floor to any questions that maybe the public may want to ask Professor Barash. Bueno, muchas gracias al profesor Barash por esta conferencia, que ha sido realmente muy interesante. Y ahora abrimos el espacio para cualquiera que quiera realizar una pregunta, puede realizar en español, o también oralmente, digamos, o también por el chat, anotarla, y nosotros la compartiremos para que el profesor la responda, sea en inglés o en español.
Le solicitamos, agrego a lo que recién comentaba Ezequiel, que les solicitamos que no sean comentarios para facilitar la tarea del traductor, que en este caso que sean preguntas concisas y directas, lo posible.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, perfectly.
Se me oye en el canal en español, ¿no? Sí. Bueno, hago una pregunta yo entonces. La pregunta tendría que ver con si para oponer a la línea que el profesor Barash identifica con la tradición voluntarista, luterana, Cassirer extrajo, explotó, trabajó, buscó motivos en la tradición del humanismo latino para contrastar la antropología de la caída de Lutero. Si para contrastar la teología, la antropología, la caída de Lutero y el voluntarismo político subsecuente, Cassirer se volvió hacia los desarrollos del humanismo latino o de los pensadores del siglo XVII.
Okay, Pablo Dreisig's question points toward developing or further developing the opposition between, or in order to counterpoint the voluntarist tradition forwarded by Luther, if Cassirer then worked deeper the motives of the humanist tradition of the 17th century, and if that opposition or if that development can be deepened by or furtherly commented by Professor Barash.
That's a very interesting question. It's interesting also because Grotius is known as a neo-Stoic and a member of the neo-Stoic tradition who's reviving Platonism in that way, according to Cassirer, and it's very clear. But there's another very interesting aspect to Grotius, as to Selden, who's also close to neo-Stoicism in that period, and that is the importance for them of the Hebrew tradition. It's interesting that Cassirer doesn't mention this, But Selden, for example, and Grotius both pointed out the laws of Noah, the Noahide laws, as being one of the central sources of natural law, and of this tradition that is, according to Grotius and especially Selden, is brought together as a basis of this Stoic tradition. It's a very, very interesting argument, and interesting also because then later on, Levinas takes this up. Levinas points out specifically in talking about, in his book, À l'heure des nations, he talks about the fact that both Selden and Grotius underline the importance of the Talmud and of the Talmudic interpretation of the laws of Noah, which are universally valid, even for non-Jews. They're the 7 famous laws of Noah. And even non-Jews who obey these laws and are observant, they don't have to be Jewish, and they can participate according to Maimonides in eternal life. So this for Selden and Grotius, looking back at Maimonides and looking back at the Jewish tradition, was a central source of the natural law tradition in the West. And it's fun. Cassirer never mentions this. He doesn't deal with this at all. Hermann Cohen does. Hermann Cohen is perhaps the first who really picks up on this very important root. And there's a great emphasis in Religion der Vernunft, in Cohen's last great work, in which he deals precisely with this source in the Talmud of the natural law tradition. And so I think that this is a very, very important point, that Cassirer himself was not interested in the specifically Jewish roots of this tradition. Undoubtedly, he knew this, at least through reading Hermann Cohen, his teacher. But I think that what is really important is the idea, you remember that Grotius wrote in his book on war and peace, on the laws of war and peace, on the laws of war and nations, I guess you translate it, and peoples. He said that even if there were no God, let us pretend, this is really a very radical statement for a 17th century thinker. Even if there were no God, as he says in the preface to this work, the laws of justice and equity, the fundamental laws of ethics and politics would still be valid, because they don't need the arbitrary decision of an omnipotent God to be true. And they don't depend on God's will, because their truth is, as Plato would have said, is epikeinates ousias, it's beyond being, which is the title, of course, of Levinas's great book, Beyond Being, Otherwise Than Being, which he takes precisely from Plato and radicalizes the Platonic insight. But it's interesting to see the way that beyond Hermann Cohen, the way that Levinas and Cassirer are both saying something very similar, but from different perspectives. Levinas emphasizing the roots in Selden and Grotius, going back to their own reference to the Talmud and the Talmudic sources of natural law, and Cassirer concentrating much more on the Platonic and Neo-Stoic origins. But it's interesting, the complementarity is very important, it seems to me. Does that answer your question? Would you like other aspects, talk about other aspects of it?
I'm sorry, Professor Barash, I'm gonna do a small translation. I'm gonna do a small interpretation translation of your answer, and then we can continue. Just to, solamente para sintetizar un poco la respuesta del profesor Barash, el profesor, luego de la pregunta de Pablo Dreisig, remarcó la importancia de la tradición hebrea y talmúdica en los temas que estamos trabajando, particularmente de las 7 leyes de Noah, como fuentes de la ley natural, digamos, y como base de la tradición naturalista, y que muchas veces el público en general, aunque no pertenezcan a la tradición judía, igualmente respetan esas leyes, que es algo que excede esa pertenencia y que uno puede, que digamos, son leyes mucho más universales como base fundamental de la tradición naturalista, y que este tema lo ha trabajado Levinas también. Por otro lado, mencionaba el profesor Barash que Cassirer, aunque no lo menciona, sí conocía de esta cuestión, y el que sí conocía esta cuestión, y que por eso podemos asumir que Cassirer sí conocía de esto, es Hermann Cohen, el profesor, digamos, de Cassirer. Hermann Cohen va a hacer énfasis en esto también en su última gran obra. Esto es lo que mencionaba el profesor Barash. Y por último, el profesor Barash hizo referencia, por último, a una frase muy interesante de Grocio, que dice que aun si no hubiera Dios, la ley de la justicia, la ley de la ética, la ley de la política serían igualmente válidas, que no necesitamos una fundamentación divina para poder afirmar la validez de este tipo de leyes que ordenan la vida. Okay, si hay alguna otra pregunta, if there's any more questions, we are open to those questions. I'm sorry, Professor, I'm doing a synthesis of your answers. That is why it's not as long as your answer.
It sounds wonderful to me.
Perfect. Si hay otra pregunta a través del chat o a través de oralmente, pueden levantar la mano y los pondremos, les activaremos el audio para que puedan realizar la pregunta. Acá tenemos una pregunta de Jorge Coelho. Vamos a activar el audio, un segundito. Ahí pueden hablar, ¿no, Jorge?
Okay. Are you listening? You can listen to me? Okay.
Yes, I can do it.
So, good evening, or I'm speaking from Portugal. I have a question. I think it's a little bit, I don't know if behind or behind the team, but what do you think, Cassirer, because you're talking about his thoughts about question God, and it's rather behind his time. So what do you think about Cassirer will, if he will ever thought about that? If it was man who create God, or as the standards do, God creates man. If you think he thought about that, and if so, what you might think it's his questions and his answers. Thank you.
Voy a traducir rápidamente. Sorry, I will translate quickly. La pregunta del participante Jorge Coelho tiene que ver con qué piensa el profesor Barash al respecto de la cuestión de Dios y cuál es la postura de Cassirer al respecto. Yes, please, Professor.
Should I answer it? Yeah. It's a very good question, a very important question. Cassirer was, of course, very, very discreet in this way. I mean, it was different. You know that his student, Leo Strauss, was very critical of him. He thought that he'd kind of betrayed the ethical message of Hermann Cohen. I think that Cassirer, where it's a question of God and religion, is extremely discreet throughout his career. But I think that there are several places where there is a sense of religion, a deep sense of religion that comes out in his thinking. I think the most important, perhaps, is in the very last 2 years of his life, when he was at Yale and at Columbia University, and he gave a talk on Judaism and myth, and how Judaism, in fact, resisted the force of magic, and a very, very important theme. And here he's talking about this in the aftermath of the Shoah. He really had all of a sudden, as everybody had all of a sudden realized what had happened in the period just as the war was concluding. It became evident how, in fact, extensive the horror was. And he made some beautiful speeches. One of them was at the gravesite of Hermann Cohen. earlier on. And later in this article on Judaism and myth, must have been 1944, if my memory is correct, but it's in his collected works. And he comes, it's so very respectful of the of Judaism and religion and its importance. He doesn't directly say, you know, talk about God, but I think that the idea of a rational order, of an order that is a cosmos in the Greek sense of the term, the idea that he puts on spiritualization and on such ideas that the transcendence was a very important factor in the spiritualization. I think that you can gather from that many threads that show that although he was very discreet, he's very respectful and perhaps also a believer. I mean, he did give the speeches in synagogues at the end of his life. So this was not something foreign to him at all. And it's hard to say, you know, what his real deepest convictions were. But I think that from his writings, in spite of his discretion and his refusal to really come out and talk about religion openly in the way that Levinas or Hermann Cohen or Rosenzweig did, I think nonetheless the respect and the kind of deep conviction in the moral order of the universe definitely had a religious inspiration. At least I read it in that way, even if that is somewhat of an interpretation. But I think there's nothing anywhere in his philosophy that would lead us to question this aspect of his respect and his deep reverence for the Jewish tradition in general. So that would be the only answer I can actually give to you.
1 second. Okay, so what? So the answer by Professor Barash points to the fact. Perdón, estoy hablando en inglés. Cassirer, lo que está planteando el profesor Barash, Cassirer es muy discreto a lo largo de su carrera y a lo largo de sus escritos en relación a este tema de la divinidad y de Dios, pero que se puede igual a lo largo de sus escritos, a lo largo de su carrera y a lo largo de su vida, deducir un sentido profundo de religión. De hecho, en los últimos dos años de su vida, plantea el profesor Barash, Cassirer da una serie de conferencias, una serie de charlas, una charla en particular en relación con el judaísmo y el mito. El profesor Barash cree que esto se dio en el año 1944, y donde plantea, donde empieza a hablar de estos temas, aunque no de forma directa, de forma explícita, nunca habla directamente de Dios, pero sí de un orden racional, sí de un orden en relación con el concepto de cosmos, el concepto griego del cosmos, y de donde se puede deducir cierta idea de trascendencia. Por otro lado, el profesor Barash destaca que Cassirer era muy respetuoso, que no hay elementos, no se pueden encontrar elementos en su filosofía que podrían llevar a que nosotros pensemos un elemento contradictorio a la idea de la divinidad o a la idea de Dios. Es difícil de decir, no hay elementos explícitos en su obra, pero en sus escritos, pero se puede deducir el respeto y la convicción en relación a estas temáticas, no de forma explícita, y definitivamente no se puede deducir un elemento contradictorio que vaya en contra de la idea de divinidad, sino más bien en términos de un orden racional, en términos de, como decía antes, el concepto griego de cosmos y en relación a la trascendencia. No sé si hay alguna otra pregunta. Do we have any other questions? ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta de un participante?
Creo que el profesor Pablo Ríos tiene una pregunta que la transmito, Ezequiel.
Bueno. Acá está la pregunta, la puedo leer si querés.
Perfecto.
Sí, dice, lo voy a copiar en el chat para que todos la puedan ver. I will copy in the chat the question by Professor Pablo Ríos. I will read in Spanish and then in English for Professor Barash. En 1957, Levinas sugiere una conexión entre la filosofía de Heidegger y el pensamiento mítico, como lo describe Levi-Bruhl. La filosofía de Heidegger, desde la filosofía de Cassirer, podría verse como una concepción mítica del Dasein. So we'll translate. Do you want me to translate, Professor?
You're talking about Levinas, and that he attributed to Heidegger a mythical dimension to his thought. Is that what you're saying?
So yeah, if we translate it, it would say that in 1957, Levinas suggests a connection between Heidegger's philosophy and mythical thought as described by Levi-Bruhl. Heidegger's philosophy, in this is the question itself, can Heidegger's philosophy from Cassirer's philosophy be seen or be thought as a conception of, as a mythical conception of the Dasein?
That's a good question, a difficult question. In fact, I've actually just written an article on that, and it's coming out as a chapter in my next book in April. And so I can send it to you if you like, but my conclusion is this. In fact, Levinas and Cassirer were astonishingly close, in spite of the fact, that Levinas was participating. He was in the audience at Davos, and he listened to the Davos debate, and he regretted very much the role that he played in a kind of a theater piece afterward that's well known, in which he kind of made fun of Cassirer, and he very much regretted this later on. And the argument of my article is that, in fact, when you look at Levinas's later political thinking, it's incredibly close to Cassirer's. I mean, Cassirer talks about the Stoic, Neo-Stoic, and Stoic and Platonic traditions. Levinas radicalizes the Platonic tradition, but nonetheless talks about the importance of the attribution of this Neo-Stoic background to natural law that he sees in Maimonides and the Noahide laws. So I think there are parallels that are astounding. But on the specific question of myth, I think there's something very important. And I don't say this in the chapter that I wrote, but I'll say it now because there's another parallel that I think is very important. You see, at the end of the talk that I just gave, what I said was that, in fact, for Cassirer, Heidegger's thought had no relation to theology in any traditional sense of the word, and that he was participating in a kind of a modern form of 20th century mythology, fabricated myths in the sense of the myth of the state, that in fact went beyond anything that was traditionally mythical. In my interpretation, Levinas goes even farther. Levinas goes even farther. You're talking about an essay in 1957. But if you look at the later writings of Levinas, and especially Totalité Infinie and Autrement qu'être, those two works of a later period, my argument would be that he says this very clearly in Autrement qu'être, and this is the kind of the conclusion of my article, and that is that, in fact, he refuses to associate Heidegger's thinking with myth. For him, he says that what Heidegger is advocating is a kind of existence that is specifically 20th century. It's a philosophy, as Levinas says, I quote him, he says, it's a philosophy of the absurd. And myth for him is closer to what he calls the element and the initial primitive enjoyment of the element, or primordial enjoyment of the element, but he does not associate myth with the absurd. And Levinas specifically says that precisely because Heidegger's philosophy has to do with the absurd forms of 20th century violence, that this also has nothing to do with a traditional mythical framework. So that Levinas, of course, Cassirer would also say that we're not talking about traditional mythology. We're talking about fabricated myths that are specific to the 20th century. So there's actually a parallel there also between Cassirer and Levinas. Well, I think that Levinas goes farther in even not wanting to attribute the word myth itself to Heidegger's thought, saying that Geworfenheit, this is the way that Levinas phrases it, the Geworfenheit is something beyond anything that myth has to say. Geworfenheit, the dimension of the absurd, the violence of the 20th century, this is something that cannot be associated with traditional mythology. I think this is a very important point that you're bringing up in the thought both of Cassirer and of Levinas.
Perfecto. Bueno, voy a traducir entonces lo que plantea el profesor Barash en relación a la pregunta que relaciona a Levinas, a Heidegger con el pensamiento mítico. Lo que plantea el profesor Barash en principio es que entre Levinas y Cassirer hay una cierta cercanía que se dio más adelante, más tarde en la vida de Levinas. De hecho, Levinas, según plantea el profesor Barash, estuvo presente en el debate de Davos y que más tarde en su vida, más adelante en su vida, se arrepintió, Levinas, del rol que cumplió en Davos, digamos, criticando y poniendo en cuestión, en crítica a Cassirer. Más tarde en su vida, de hecho, le va a dar relevancia a Cassirer, y lo que plantea el profesor Barash es que justamente esta temática está ahora redactando un artículo con respecto a esta temática, y que en la conclusión de su artículo, el profesor Barash plantearía en este artículo que Levinas va más allá de Heidegger, y que particularmente si pensamos los escritos tardíos de Levinas, puntualmente Totalidad e Infinito, no pude llegar a escuchar el otro texto que mencionó el profesor, pero en Totalidad e Infinito y en estos escritos tardíos de Levinas, rechazaría asociar el pensamiento de Heidegger con el pensamiento mítico, planteando que Heidegger estaría proponiendo un tipo de existencia típica del siglo XX, digamos, típica del siglo XX, más cercano a la idea de absurdo que a la idea del mito o el pensamiento mítico o mitológico que plantea Cassirer. Digamos que lo que estaría proponiendo Heidegger es un tipo de existencia típica del siglo XX, donde se dan estas formas absurdas, pero no tanto en relación con la mitología o el pensamiento mitológico típico de Cassirer, que tipo los que, digamos, formaliza Cassirer teóricamente, sino con las formas absurdas, más relacionadas con las formas absurdas de la violencia del siglo XX, ¿no? Entonces, lo que sí se podría pensar mitológicamente en este sentido son los mitos fabricados del siglo XX, y no tanto el pensamiento mitológico cassireriano. Ahí el profesor estaría estableciendo una diferencia, digamos, una diferencia donde no se puede identificar, ¿no? Una diferencia de contradicción.
Bueno, decía si restaba alguna pregunta, si quedaba alguna pregunta, antes de despedirnos, de dar por concluida esta magnífica sesión, y agradeciendo la generosidad en la palabra del profesor Barash, esta generosidad abrumadora quizás para Ezequiel, pero una generosidad infinita. Alguien que es generoso con la palabra es la primera generosidad, así que estamos todos hoy muy agradecidos. Y los invitamos a todos a una próxima sesión, y le agradecemos profundamente al profesor Barash su tiempo, su buena disposición, su erudición, y su disposición a contestar y a participar de esta conferencia erudita y también apasionante, ¿no? Creo que a todos nos apasionó. Bueno, that's very kind of you, Barash.
We thank in the name of the chair, we thank Jeffrey Barash, Professor Barash, for his generosity and his predisposition for all the questions for the conference itself. It was very thought-provoking, and we thank you a lot in the name of all of our chair.
Thank you. It was my great pleasure. Thank you for the wonderful translation. It sounds wonderful to hear myself in Spanish. And thank you for your attention and your wonderful questions.
Bueno, thank you very much.
I really appreciate it.
Okay.